invitation. This is a great event, and the presentations have been really wonderful, and I'm learning a lot, taking a lot of notes. So today I'm going to start presenting this project, which is just starting. I hope in the fall. I'm going to start it at the University of Ca' Foscari, Venice. And it's going to be about non-aligned biographies and about women's participation in the non-aligned movement from a biographical and intersectional perspective. And I'm going to explain what I mean by that. But first, I want to discuss a bit how I came to the idea of applying intersectionality to the context of Southeast Europe and former Yugoslavia more generally. I think I was mainly bothered with this idea that, under state socialism, women were so to say, apologists for the totalitarian regime, or we could say, manipulated into working on gender issues, when in reality they were doing this as a kind of smokescreen for the Communist Party or the state, right? So that kind of framework was very much dominant until, let's say, 10, 15 years ago, when the works of scholars such as Franziska de Haan, Christine Gozzi, and others showed that, in fact, there was a very strong grassroots activism in the post-1945 period, and also within this international Women's International Democratic Federation, or WIDF, to which the Anti-Fascist Women's Front of Yugoslavia also took part in after 1945. So this overall debate on women's political and social agency within state socialist women's organization is something I'm sure many of you are familiar with, including this famous or infamous article by Nanette Funk, which was accusing scholars working on this topic to somehow taint the reputation of women's and gender studies by defending political activists who were active under state socialism. So this idea of the lack of autonomy from the state and also this idea of the double burden has been used as key concept to argue that these organizations and their members had no agency. And this is how I started working on the topic when I was doing my PhD. And somehow I thought, why wouldn't we use intersectionality also going back in time and not just for contemporary analysis? This is something that I don't know, I'm open to have more references, but I don't see that much intersectionality being referenced in gender history as much as it is in the social sciences, for instance, or in contemporary studies of social stratification, right? So how come that it's mainly used in legal or social science works, but not so much in the history? So what happens if we instead read the history of organizations such as the Anti-Fascist Women's Front and subsequent organizations such as the Conference for the Social Activity of Women, intersectionally, to have a more nuanced picture of leaders and ordinary members, especially when it comes to what many of you talked about already, intersection of gender, class, ethnicity, generation, but also in relation to processes such as urbanization, industrialization, all these major processes that happened during the 20th century. And so after the work on the AFG, I did also some work about the successive women's organization to look at the ways in which somehow these organizations were bridging between a minority of educated city, urban women that were at the head of this organization and the local cadres or the local, let's say, activists and ordinary women, right? So I think that there is a whole field of studies there that still needs to be developed, but basically that's kind of the intersectionality applied to the micro history. So if you go micro, then what happens at this local level, at the level of the AFG, at the level of the DAJ, right? So that's something that came out of this project led by Dr. Igor Duda at the University of Pula, this team project on microsocialism. So I wrote some publications on the textile industry, which were related also to how state socialist women's organizations were working at the local level, especially trying to engage female workers and trying to work on issues such as childcare, housing, women's participation to decision-making in self-management. Like there's a whole reproductive rights, right? So that I think if we look intersectionally, we can really see that there was a certain type of grassroots activism there, even though it's not necessarily represented in what we call, like what Livius Klevitsky calls this representative sources, like the propaganda sources. We wouldn't see that much of that grassroots activism, but there were active žena in many factories, there were active žena in many villages, and they would have demands brought to the Republican level, to the federal level as well. Okay, so that's a bit how I started looking into these issues of intersectionality in relation to women's organization. But then when it comes to this project, it tries to move from the micro dimension and the, let's say, local, but it's not really local, but let's say post-Yugoslav, Southeastern European dimension, and to look at the broader dimension of the non-aligned movement. So if we think of the non-aligned movement, it's very much this male diplomatic heads of state perspective, right? The heads of state meeting for the Belgrade meeting of 1961 and founding the movement, the founders of the movement, the fathers of the movement, Tito, Nasser, Nkrumah, Nehru, and so on. And then we don't really see this micro behind the scene work, diplomatic work that was done by many activists and leaders, and also the many exchanges that happen between intellectuals, artists. There's a lot happening about non-alignment in art and so on. So if we think of intersectionality for the project, I would like to use it as a transnational methodological lens to analyze women's biographies across NAM countries, because of course all of these women had different cultures, ethnicities, religion, backgrounds. But also we could look at how within the non-aligned movement there was a certain degree of anticipation of the topics that came about in terms of intersectionality. And of course intersectionality is something very much related to Black feminism in the United States, but even Black feminists in the United States were very much inspired by decolonization movements in the Third World, and so there was a lot of cross-cultural communication going on there. So what if we could look at this non-aligned debates on women's rights, gender and development in the global East and South as precursors to debates on intersectionality? And I think Christine Godsey is making this argument in her book Second Word, Second Sex, when she's looking at the ways in which organizations, women's organizations from Bulgaria and from Zambia were bringing these issues of intersection between gender and development to the United Nations Decade for Women, right? And against this idea that feminism only needs to deal with women's rights and not with all these other issues. And then instead there was this topic, no, but we cannot leave other issues behind, because how can we talk about women's emancipation if there is apartheid, poverty, colonization, and so on, right? So on this I would also recommend Jocelyn Olcott's book about the Mexico City conference, in which she's talking about this encounter between different generations of women, but also different positionalities of activists. So to look at the project, so the project is going to look at 4 different strands. So one are the biographies. So as I was interested in your slide that you didn't show, Jovana, about the documents. So this classification, if you can show it later, like really what do we mean by biographical material, what kind of biographies. There are a number of biographies by some of these activists in the non-aligned movement. There are also some biographical collections, archival collections. I'm going to come back to that at the end. And so how can we understand the differences between these women, but also how they sort of partook in this common imaginary of what I call this gender imaginary of modernization and development, or gender imaginary of citizenship, like what should a new woman look like, what should a modern woman look like, modern family, how did they envision this idea of modernity in some kind of utopian way, right? That was sort of breaking the mold of family as we think of. And also some, like most of the women we singled out for the project together with my research assistant, they were active in family planning. Okay, so they were the ones that were, before feminism, they were active in promoting contraception, reproductive rights, at the time in which it was not framed as feminist issue yet, but it was mostly framed as population politics. Okay, but still there was this idea that the child has the right to be born wanted, and the child has the right to be born only when the parents are conscious and responsible, and not, for women to have 10 pregnancies one after the other and ruin their lives, basically. So what about that idea of reproductive rights and modernization of reproductive rights? So connected to the biographies, there are, of course, as I mentioned, the women's organizations and their archives. So how women's mass organizations acted as bridges between women of different social status, and how they became fundamental for socialist and post-colonial state formation during the Cold War. And here, I think there is also something to think about critically, is this element of state control, right? So this, in most of the countries, I will be analyzing, this organization were state-sponsored. And this often meant that independent organizations that were there before, they were either silenced or curtailed or not accepted anymore. So what about this level of, we could say, state control, and what about the state feminism hindering other forms of grassroots feminism? So what are the connection between the grassroots there and the top-down? And this was something that the evaluation panel was very keen for me to acknowledge, that these were elite women, right? But I don't think that's the main problem. I think the main problem is what were the discourses of the state and how they function to sort of police certain forms of family or certain, heteronormativity. Yes, some of them, they were elite women, but they also often broke certain barriers or boundaries to come to their place. Some of them were coming from working class families, for instance. So I think there needs to be a nuance, and we shouldn't also fall into the thing, they were apologists for their own regimes or totalitarian regimes again, but at the same time there was a level of state control. So another element of the project is going to be the one about international conferences and their documentation. And so the UN Decade for Women was this moment in which an enormous amount of documentation came about, because states were mandated to do research about the status of women in their own country. But at the same time, there were also some meetings on the status of women that were organized by the non-aligned movement. So, and these were in places like Havana, Delhi, Baghdad. So there were these encounters between experts of the non-aligned movement about the status of women that were also related to the UN Decade and how to bring the non-aligned position into the UN Decade. So this should open up new perspective on East-South and South-South connections in the global women's movement, especially on family planning, and should challenge current historiography, which is largely oriented towards the global north. And this is something that Gotzi explains very well in her book, saying that most of the women who have been writing about the UN Decade for Women is mainly Western women with good resources, who could leave their archive to some rich libraries in the United States, most likely. And you go there, and I've been to the Schlesinger Library. It's the most well-organized library I've ever seen. Literally every paper is cataloged in a digital archive. You look into the digital archive for something, you find it, and like every folder is like, you see that there's been an enormous amount of investment done into that in comparison to, the state archives in Zagreb, where you get boxes and you don't know what you're gonna find. So I think there's also a whole issue of imbalance in knowledge production and what's happening with that, and whose voices are valorized in the canon of transnational feminism, right? And then again, transnational knowledge production and key publication. So most of these women were connected with each other. They knew each other. They had some exchanges, some letters. I still have to do some more work, but for instance, Vida Tomšić, she did quite a lot of correspondence with Sirimavo Bandaranaike, the Premier of Sri Lanka. Aziza Hussain, she was also in touch with some of the Yugoslav women from Egypt. So they were translating each other, right? So this is an article by Nevenka Petric that was translated, for instance, into French and Arabic by the Tunisian association, that was the Tunisian Women's Organization, that was also part of the IPPF. So one part of the project will explore how NAM leaders formulated alternative approaches to women's rights, which emphasize the interdependence between women's emancipation and social justice at a global level, and how this happened through knowledge production in terms of monographs, pamphlets, translations, and so on. And I think that emphasis on the interdependency between women's emancipation and social justice at the global level is something that is really strong in a number of these women's thinking and writing, and of course you're familiar with probably both of them, which just to go through their biographies briefly. So I selected a few biographies, and I think there's going to be more women that are going to be relevant for the project. This was just we selected a number of women that will have enough biographical material and enough collections to be able to be part, like to deserve a research in their own right. And so definitely the archives, the collections here with the Tomšić in Ljubljana, they're really amazing. And then also the work of Nevenka Petrić, which is can be found mostly in Belgrade, but also which her son largely digitalized, because he's a tech guru in the Silicon Valley in San Francisco, and he did incredible work, including this incredible Wikipedia page that I found when I was looking for info on her, and I was like, what? Who did this? And then, Voja, her son, is really active in preserving her memory, so I think that's also something that needs to be engaged with more, like what happened with the legacy of these women and who's remembering them. And so with Tomšić, she was born in Ljubljana in a school teacher family. She joined the communist movement in the 30s, and she was arrested already in the 30s. And then during the war, under Italian occupation, she gave birth, and then her husband was executed, and she was condemned to 25 years in jail. She managed to escape after the fall of Italy in 1943 and to rejoin her son. And then she was appointed to a variety of positions, including Minister for Social Policy by the national government of Slovenia. And she remarried to Dr. Franz Novak, who was also a very important actor in designing reproductive policies in Yugoslavia, and they were both instrumental in having this right to freely decide about childbirth inscribed in the 1974 Constitution. And so with Tomšić, she was active in the United Nations, in the ECOSOC, also very active in the IPPF, and on the board of the INSTRA, which was the International Research and Training Institute for the Advancement of Women, founded in Santo Domingo in the late 70s. And I get quite annoyed when people tell me, but she was an apologist for a totalitarian regime, blah, blah. And I'm like, yeah, but she was still interested in gender issues, let's say from the 30s up until, 1995, the Beijing conference. She kept asking, she died in 1998. So until 1995, she kept asking for information about the conference in Beijing. And so I think that's proves enough that it was an authentic commitment of her and an authentic interest in really trying to improve women's lives. And she was really a scholar. I mean, from what I could see from her papers and her letters, she especially towards the last part of her life, she was engaging more in some kind of scholarly scientific work, right? And this all of this international connection were also enabling to get funding and to get projects going. So it was very similar to what we would do now as academics, I would say. And that's what her daughter also told me in an interview. She was happiest in her studio, in her office, right, doing her academic work. Nevenka Petrić, also a very important figure. She also had a very difficult start during World War II. She lost her father, brother, and one of her three sisters. The whole family took part in the resistance. And later she was one of the leaders of the youth organization, and had various offices, including chief officer for health and social policy in Banja Luka and Belgrade Old Town. Then she became secretary of the Conference for the Social Activity of Women in the 60s. And then in 67, she was elected vice president for the Federal Council for Family Planning in Yugoslavia, for which she presided then the following year for 4 years. She was also extremely active in this International Planned Parenthood Federation Europe region. And in the 80s, she led this courses sponsored by the UN Population Fund in Sarajevo, which were including women from Asian Africa, and they were talking about Planned Parenthood and women's emancipation, and her son kindly shared some of these pictures with me. I've been trying to track back some of these women, I couldn't. But like some of them can be found online, but especially for the African women, it was very hard to track who they were. So I think that's also might be part of the project as a mini case study to see what happens with these women afterwards. Was this course useful for them? What did they got out of this course? And what kind of networks were established? And Vida, she was also one of the lecturers. So this is from 1988, quite late. And the course went until the summer of 91. So it was just until before the war that they kept going. And also, you were mentioning the friendships. I think you wanna this whole issue of the friendship. You see that there was a whole degree of collaborators and women working together on this project from all of this correspondence. And so I think that's also something that's gonna be part of the research, like to what extent there was some kind of critical mass of women working together. Like it was not just about the leadership, but about women working together in a movement. And that's something that Gerda Lerner, you might be familiar with her. She was part of this Congress of American Women, which was part of the WADF, and later she became one of the most important women's historians in the States. She was born in Vienna as a Jewish woman, and she escaped during the Nazi occupation. So they interview her towards the end of her life, and she said, "I'm tired of people asking me about the leaders. All the academics, they all want to know about the leaders, but this was a grassroots movement, and we were all equally important. We didn't know about the leaders or who was the leader. It was like a collective, right? So the sense of the collective, I think that's something important. And this is just an example of the kind of conversations that this is from 83. So Vida Tomšić will be 70, and Nevenka Pečić will be in her mid-50s. So they say, Nevenka writes her, "Dear Vida, I warmly thank you for the booklet that was sent to me as per your request, in which is published your work in English on the politics of non-alignment, the struggle for a new international order, and the role of women in development. This work of yours will be a precious tool to orient myself in various situations." And something else. In relation to our last talks about my work in Schedule, the relevant personnel services in the Republic of Serbia recommended me as the substitute president for the Commission of Cooperation with UNESCO. This is a voluntary position. What do you think of this recommendation? They told me that people will seriously compete for the place. Will you perhaps support this candidacy through your channels? As it seems there will be various candidates. So that gives a sense of that Vida Tomšić had an important role in also placing some people in this international organization. And for instance, the Instro was presided by Dunje Pastici Ferencic from Croatia. So that's also like that issue of veze, and was that extending at the international level or no? And then she was complaining about this Miss Yugoslavia contest, and she said that she was shocked about that contest, and then that this professor in Belgrade was happy about it. She says, "No, who knows? Maybe I'm getting old." But she didn't like that Miss Yugoslavia competition, and then warm greetings. And then she said, "I'm an expert of the UNFPA." And so, they were just really sharing their opinions, but also sending greetings to their families, being very warm with each other. So I think that whole element of friendship will have to be investigated further. And just to conclude, this will be some of the collections and figures that I'm planning to look at together with the team, and some of the archives. So really suggestions welcome for further references or further ideas about how this could be also implemented, also in relation to all this interest for the non-aligned movement that is materializing at the moment in the whole post-Yugoslav region, right? There's quite a lot happening. So thank you so much for your attention.